The small cafe on the corner of Elm Street was known for its welcoming atmosphere, its warm, aromatic coffee, and the steady hum of chatter between its regulars. This morning, however, there was an undercurrent of something different. The sun was just beginning to break through the clouds, casting a golden light over the rows of tables. But in the back corner of the room, there was a tension in the air that didn't belong. Jack Thompson, a man in his late 40s, wearing his worn-out army jacket, walked through the door with a quiet dignity. The bell above the door jingled, signaling his arrival. But the moment he stepped inside, something shifted. People glanced up, some of them quickly looking away, others uncomfortable with the presence of someone who seemed so out of place in this everyday cafe. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Jack made his way to the counter, where the young woman behind it, Emily, greeted him with a forced smile. She looked down at her register, her fingers hesitating for just a moment, then went through the motions of taking Jack's order. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, as though she wasn't sure what to make of him. When Jack asked for a simple black coffee and a pastry, her response was cool, almost dismissive. "Sorry, sir, we're not serving right now," Emily said, her voice flat. "We're not taking orders from people like you." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. He thought he had misheard her. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" he asked, leaning forward, unsure if he had misunderstood. Emily glanced up, avoiding his gaze, her tone not changing. "I said, we're not serving you. You're going to have to leave," Emily repeated, her words sharp and final. A silence fell over the cafe, the kind of silence that made even the most mundane sounds seem amplified. The customers around Jack shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting from him to the counter, unsure of how to react. Some looked away, trying to pretend they hadn't heard. Others watched, waiting for Jack to say something. Jack stood there for a moment, stunned. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to cause trouble, but the insult was so brazen, so unnecessary, that he couldn't just walk away. He knew this wasn't just about coffee anymore. It was about something much larger. His hand clenched around the counter, but he kept his voice calm. "You're refusing to serve me because of what I'm wearing?" Jack asked, his voice steady, but his frustration building. Emily gave a shrug, her eyes flicking nervously to the other customers, but she held firm. "It's a policy, sir. We don't serve people like you." Ryan, a regular customer sitting at the far end of the cafe, overheard the exchange. He had been coming here for years, always with a smile and a friendly word for anyone he passed. He had seen Jack in the community before, a veteran, quiet but kind, who had fought for this country, and who wore his scars in the form of old jackets and a slow gait. Ryan couldn't understand why someone would treat him this way. This wasn't just about a coffee order. It was about the kind of man Jack was, and what that meant to a lot of people. Ryan stood up from his table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Heads turned, and for a moment, the cafe felt like it was holding its breath. There was a tension in the air that no one had expected, and it was growing by the second. He walked toward the counter where Emily was still standing, her posture stiff, unsure of what to do next. "What's going on here?" Ryan's voice cut through the quiet. He looked directly at Emily, his gaze intense but measured. "What's this about?" Emily flinched slightly under his gaze, but didn't answer. Instead, she turned her back to him, clearly hoping this moment would pass, that maybe if she ignored it, it would go away. Ryan's frustration grew, and he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. He wasn't going to let this slide. He was a regular here, a man who valued honesty and respect, and he wasn't about to let Jack be treated like this. With a deep breath, Ryan turned to the rest of the cafe, his eyes scanning the faces of the people around him. He could feel the collective discomfort in the room, the unspoken divide between right and wrong. There was one sentence, one simple statement that had the power to turn everything around. He knew it, and he couldn't wait anymore. "I'll pay for whatever he wants," Ryan said, his voice strong and steady. "And you better hope I don't have to say it again." The room went silent. All eyes turned to him, and the weight of his words hung in the air. Emily froze, her mouth slightly open as she processed what had just happened. The other patrons, who had been sitting quietly, began to stir. A few murmurs of agreement echoed around the cafe. Some faces softened, others looked between Emily and Jack, but all of them were waiting for what would come next. Ryan's eyes never left Emily's as he spoke again, this time with quiet authority. "You're not going to treat him like that. Not in here, not today." There was a long pause as Emily struggled with the situation, the realization dawning on her that the room was no longer on her side. Slowly, she turned toward Jack, who had remained silent through the exchange. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice quieter now, tinged with a mix of embarrassment and regret. "I'm sorry," she said, though it barely registered in the room. "I shouldn't have said that. Please, let me take your order." Jack, still standing, looked at her with a quiet dignity that seemed to deflate the tension in the room. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave hers. There was no anger, no bitterness in his gaze, only understanding and a silent acknowledgement of the moment that had just unfolded. "I'll take that coffee now," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. Emily moved to prepare his order, her hands shaky, as the others in the cafe started to murmur among themselves. Ryan stayed by Jack's side, his quiet defiance lingering in the air, a reminder that sometimes one person's courage could change everything. As Jack sat down at an empty table by the window, he couldn't help but feel a sense of something he hadn't felt in a long time: respect. Not because he had asked for it, but because it had been earned, by Ryan standing up for him, by the people in the cafe who had realized in that moment that the treatment of one person affected them all. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like maybe this town wasn't so cold after all. Maybe there were still people who would stand up for what was right. But as he looked out the window, the sound of footsteps approaching him caused him to glance up. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but for the first time that morning, he wasn't so alone in the fight. The air in the cafe seemed to shift after Ryan's words. People began to speak again, their voices tentative at first, but gradually growing stronger, more certain. The atmosphere was different now, less tense, as if the silence had been broken open, and something important had been acknowledged. The hum of conversations filled the space again, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a quiet sense of solidarity. Jack sat at his table, his back against the wall, looking out the window. He wasn't angry anymore. It wasn't about the insult anymore. It was about what had just happened, about the way the room had changed in an instant. He had been treated like an outsider, unwanted in a place that should have been his right to enjoy. But what Ryan had done was bigger than just standing up for him. It was a reminder that sometimes standing up for the right thing could move mountains. He took a deep breath, letting the tension of the moment leave his body. He hadn't expected anything like this. He'd expected the usual, the quiet humiliation that came with being a veteran in a world that had long since moved on from people like him. The world didn't have room for soldiers anymore, for men and women who had served. But this was different. This had been about respect. It had been about dignity. The coffee came, and Jack didn't hesitate. He picked up the mug, took a long sip, and felt the warmth spread through him, grounding him in the present. He could still hear the murmur of conversation, feel the weight of eyes on him. But now, it was different. People weren't looking at him with pity or judgment. They were looking at him as someone who had been a part of something bigger, a man who had earned his place. Ryan had sat back down at his own table, watching Jack from across the room. But there was something else in his eyes now. He wasn't just watching the older man with a sense of guilt or obligation. No, this time, Ryan was watching with admiration. He had seen firsthand the way his father had fought for his family, the way his father had fought for honor, even when it wasn't asked of him. But now, watching Jack, Ryan realized there was something deeper at play here. There was something about standing up for what was right that transcended everything else. Ryan wasn't just standing for a principle. He was standing for a man who had done more than he would ever truly understand. He wanted to go over and say something, to do more than just watch from a distance. But he also knew that sometimes it wasn't words that changed things. Sometimes it was just being there, being present. So he sat in his chair, watching as the cafe's energy shifted, as the hum of normalcy began to return. But something had changed, not just for Jack, but for everyone in that room. They had witnessed something important, a moment of courage, of truth, and of silent rebellion. As the morning continued, Emily, still at the counter, glanced over at Jack from time to time. The nervousness that had been so evident in her earlier movements had started to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. She had done something she had never expected to do, something that had made her realize just how much she had taken for granted. She hadn't understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to wear the weight of something bigger than oneself. But now she did. When she finally caught Jack's eye, she offered him a tentative smile. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something. It was a gesture of understanding, of acknowledgement, of respect. And in that moment, Jack returned the smile. Not because he had forgiven her, not because he was simply letting it go, but because it felt like a step in the right direction. The door opened again, and in walked another customer, an older woman who had been sitting at a table across the room. She paused, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She looked around, and her gaze landed on Jack. The recognition was instant. Jack had been a familiar face in the community for years, and although he wasn't one for drawing attention to himself, she could see what had happened. Without missing a beat, she walked over to Jack's table and sat down across from him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice warm but respectful. "I saw what happened. You're a better man than I am, that's for sure." Jack chuckled softly, looking at the woman for a moment before nodding. "I don't know about that," he replied, his voice low but firm. "But it's about time someone said something." She smiled, a little more freely now. That's the thing about people. They don't always know what they are capable of until someone shows them how to stand up. She leaned in slightly, her eyes filled with understanding. "Thank you. You might not realize it, but you've taught us all something today." Jack looked down at his coffee for a moment, his thoughts far away. But then he looked back up at the woman, and there was a quiet appreciation in his gaze. "It wasn't me," he said softly. "It was Ryan." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Ryan?" "Yeah, the guy who stepped in," Jack explained. "He's the one who made it right. He's the one who did what needed to be done." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Well, looks like you've raised him right." Jack felt something deep stir in him at her words, a quiet warmth that made him realize just how much the world had changed around him in a matter of hours. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him, but here he was sitting in a cafe where, just an hour ago, he had been told to leave. And now, he wasn't just a veteran. He was part of something bigger, part of a community that had come together and learned to value what was important. As the morning stretched into afternoon, more patrons came and went, each one acknowledging Jack in some small way, whether with a nod of respect or a quiet smile. The cafe had become a microcosm of what the town could be. It was a place where small actions could start a ripple, where courage could create change. And as Jack finished his coffee, the taste of it lingering on his tongue, he realized that what had begun as a painful moment had turned into something transformative. When he left the cafe that day, he did so with his head held high, his heart a little lighter. Ryan watched him go from his seat, feeling a quiet satisfaction in his chest. He hadn't just done the right thing. He had started something, and no matter how small it seemed, that something had the power to change everything. The next few days felt like a quiet turning point for the town, though Ryan wasn't sure how to pinpoint exactly when the shift occurred. It wasn't one grand gesture, nor was it some dramatic event that could be easily identified. It was a series of smaller, quieter moments. People smiled more when they saw each other. The usual cold distance that sometimes defines small-town interactions seemed to have been replaced with something warmer, something more genuine. It felt like, in some small but important way, the town was healing. Ryan couldn't help but think about Jack in the days that followed. He didn't know him well, not really, but he couldn't forget the way Jack had sat there, taking the coffee and the pastry without causing a scene. He had let the words fall without raising his voice, his eyes calm but filled with something deeper, dignity. The moment they shared in that cafe wasn't about the right to a cup of coffee. It wasn't even about Emily's mistake. It was about how far people were willing to go when they saw something wrong, when they stepped up to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. The quiet respect Jack had earned that day wasn't just about his past or the things he had done. It was about who he was now, the man who had fought, not just in battle, but in life. And Ryan realized, with a sudden clarity, that the best thing he could do was to carry that lesson forward. Not just to stand up for his family, but to stand up for anyone who needed it. To be the kind of person who knew what was worth fighting for, and more importantly, knew when to speak out and make a stand. As the days passed, Ryan found himself at the cafe more often. He didn't expect anything extraordinary. He just found comfort in the familiar, his own corner table, the worn wood of the counter, the quiet hum of conversation. The town hadn't completely transformed, but there was something different now. Even Emily seemed to have changed. She was more open, more attentive to her customers, a little more humble in the way she carried herself. She had apologized to Jack that day, but the apology wasn't just a few words of regret. It had been the beginning of something more. She was learning, slowly but surely, how to respect the people around her, to treat everyone with the dignity they deserved, regardless of their history. One afternoon, just as Ryan was about to sit down at his usual table, Emily caught his eye. She smiled, a real smile this time, and motioned for him to come over. Her movements were a little more uncertain than usual, but there was a sincerity in her expression that made Ryan pause. "Hey, Ryan," she said as he approached the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "I wanted to thank you." Ryan blinked in surprise. "Thank me?" "For what you did that day, for standing up for Jack. You didn't have to, but you did, and I saw something in you that day that I hadn't seen in a while in this town. People actually standing up for each other. It made me realize just how much I'd been missing." Ryan shifted on his feet, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. "I was just doing what anyone else would have done." "No," Emily said, shaking her head. "You weren't. Most people wouldn't have, and it's made me think a lot about how I treat people. I don't want to be that person anymore, the one who judges without understanding. I've been doing a lot of reflecting since that day, and I wanted you to know that I'm changing. That apology wasn't just for Jack. It was for everyone I've ever wronged." Ryan didn't know what to say to that. He had never expected an apology from Emily, especially not one that came with such self-awareness. He just nodded, unsure of what to feel. It wasn't like he was looking for her approval, but there was something important about hearing those words, something that made him realize just how much power a single moment could have. "Just keep doing better," Ryan said quietly, "and keep making things right." Emily smiled, her eyes reflecting a kind of gratitude that spoke volumes. She didn't need to say anything more. They stood there for a moment, not quite awkward, but not entirely comfortable either. The air between them felt different now, lighter in a way, like the past had somehow loosened its grip on both of them. Ryan returned to his table, the weight of the conversation settling on him. It wasn't about the immediate changes. It wasn't about one moment of courage or standing up to injustice. It was about the long-term impact, the quiet ripple that spread through the town, through the people, until it reached even the most unexpected places. Emily wasn't the same person she had been a week ago, and that change wasn't just because of what had happened with Jack. It was because she had seen something, had learned something, and that was the kind of thing that changed a town. Later that afternoon, as Ryan sat with his coffee, the door jingled open again and Jack walked in. This time, there were no awkward glances or uncomfortable silences. There was no hesitation as Jack made his way to the counter. Emily saw him immediately, and without missing a beat, she greeted him with a genuine smile. "Jack, your usual?" she asked, already reaching for the coffee pot. Jack gave her a small, approving nod. "Yeah, thanks, Emily." The exchange was simple, but for Ryan, it was something more. It was a sign that things were moving in the right direction, that change was happening, even in small, quiet ways. The walls that had once divided them, between customers, between veterans, between anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, had started to come down. As Jack took his coffee and sat at his usual spot by the window, Ryan couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride, not because of what he had done, but because of what had happened since. The town had shifted. It had become something more than it had been. And though the journey wasn't over, Ryan felt a new sense of hope for what was to come. For the first time in a long while, Ryan believed that maybe, just maybe, things could really change. The days following the cafe incident unfolded quietly, but a shift was evident in the air. It wasn't a big dramatic change. It was subtle, like the soft light of morning that replaced the dark of night. The small town, once comfortably set in its routine, was now slowly adjusting to something new, something that had been long overdue. Ryan went through his days with a new awareness, as if the world had widened just a little bit, revealing cracks in the surface that had always been there but had never been noticed. The small act of standing up for someone, the simple yet powerful words spoken in that cafe, had set something in motion, something larger than he could have anticipated. He had done what was right, but the truth was that he was no hero. The true weight of the change lay in the people who saw it, the ones who had witnessed something they hadn't realized they were missing, the ones who would never look at the world the same way again. It was early one morning when Ryan passed by the town square on his way to school. The air was crisp, a gentle breeze sweeping through the streets, rustling the leaves on the trees. He was lost in his thoughts when he noticed the small crowd gathered in front of the cafe. At first, he thought it was nothing more than the usual morning bustle, but then he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. There, standing in front of the cafe, was a man in uniform, an army veteran by the look of his jacket and the patches on his sleeves. He wasn't alone. A few other veterans stood beside him, some holding signs. The signs were simple but powerful. Respect our veterans. We deserve better. The crowd gathered around them was growing, a mix of familiar faces and strangers, all of them drawn to the quiet protest. Ryan hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. He had been so focused on the small victory he had won for Jack at the cafe that he hadn't considered the larger, more widespread issue, the way veterans had been treated, not just by one person, but by society at large. He walked over slowly, drawn by the murmurs of the crowd and the sight of the veterans standing together. They were all older men, their faces weathered by time and experience. But there was a fire in their eyes that spoke of a past they had carried with them for far too long. One of the men noticed Ryan approaching and gave him a nod. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep but not unfriendly. "You're Ryan, right?" Ryan swallowed, surprised by the recognition. "Yeah, I am. What's going on here?" He glanced at the signs and the small crowd. "We're raising awareness," the man said. "Just a few of us, talking about the respect veterans deserve in this town. Thought it was time we did something about it." Ryan nodded, understanding now. It wasn't just about Jack or the incident at the cafe. It was about something larger, a broader issue that was affecting so many. Veterans like the ones standing here, like his own father, had given everything, and yet they were often forgotten, dismissed, treated like relics of a past war, not active, living people with needs, with rights, with dignity. "I didn't know about this," Ryan admitted, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. "I've never really thought about it like this. But you're right, something needs to change." The man who had spoken to him smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "We've been talking about this for a long time. It's just that not many people are willing to listen." Ryan felt a surge of emotion in his chest. He had stood up for Jack because it had felt right. He had done what he thought was the right thing, without knowing it would lead to something like this, something bigger. But now, standing in front of the group of veterans, hearing their words, feeling the weight of their cause, Ryan realized that what he had done wasn't enough. It was just the beginning. "I want to help," Ryan said, the words leaving his mouth before he had time to think about them. He didn't know what form that help would take, but it didn't matter. He felt it in his gut. This wasn't just about Jack anymore. This was about the community. This was about standing together and making sure that no one was overlooked. The man gave him a long look, as though sizing him up, before nodding slowly. "Good to hear, son. It's not easy. People need to see the bigger picture. They need to understand that veterans are more than just stories in the paper or faces on a monument. They're living, breathing people, and they deserve respect." Ryan's heart raced. He had only just started to understand how deep this issue ran, how ingrained it was in the very fabric of the town. But he also knew, with a clarity he hadn't had before, that this was the kind of fight he wanted to be part of. It wasn't just about his father anymore, or Jack, or even the veterans standing before him. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed or pushed aside, their contributions overlooked. He stepped closer to the group, his resolve growing stronger with each passing second. "I can't do this alone," he said, looking at the small crowd gathered around them. "But I can make sure that people start paying attention. I can make sure they know that this matters." The veterans exchanged looks, some of them nodding, others giving small gestures of approval. Ryan could feel their approval, but more than that, he could feel their hope. It was an unspoken bond that passed between them, a recognition that something important had begun. As they stood together, Ryan didn't know what the future held, but he knew this much. This was just the beginning. The town had been changed, not by one act of defiance, but by the quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest change comes not in grand gestures, but in the slow, steady process of waking up to what had been there all along. The sun was higher now, casting longer shadows across the square. As Ryan stood with the veterans, watching the people pass by, he felt something stir inside him. This wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about righting wrongs. It was about the future and the kind of town they would all create together. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan was certain of one thing. The future would be better because of what they were doing now. And it was just the beginning. Ryan spent the next few days wrestling with a sense of purpose that felt unfamiliar yet undeniable. His decision to stand alongside the veterans, to publicly express his desire to make things better, wasn't a decision he had taken lightly. It wasn't just a matter of speaking up for his father, or Jack, or the veterans outside the cafe that day. It was about the deeper, unspoken truth that ran through his entire town, a truth that Ryan had only just begun to fully understand. The town, for all its charm, its quaint streets, and its historical monuments, had built a comfortable wall of indifference over the years. People were polite, courteous, and friendly on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of avoidance, a reluctance to truly see each other, especially the people who had already given so much for their country. The veterans, the ones who had fought for the freedoms the town cherished, were too often forgotten once the flags came down, once the parades were over. It wasn't intentional cruelty. It was neglect born out of ignorance. People just didn't think about it. Until someone like Ryan stepped in, until someone called it out. By the end of that week, Ryan found himself involved in something bigger than he ever could have imagined. The cafe protest had sparked conversations across the town. What had started as a small, isolated moment of standing up for Jack had transformed into something far more significant. The veterans who had initially come together for their cause were now reaching out to the younger generation. They were offering their stories, their lessons, their struggles. It was as if they had suddenly found their voices again, and Ryan had become the bridge they needed to share those voices. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. That Friday evening, Ryan sat with his father in their modest living room. The glow of the TV cast shadows on the walls, but neither of them seemed to notice the flickering screen. Tom was focused on his drink, swirling it slowly in his hand, his gaze lost in the quiet of the room. Ryan, on the other hand, was buzzing with the energy of the past week. The town was starting to change, to talk openly about the things they had long ignored. The cafe protest had made ripples, and now there were plans to start a veteran support group, one that would address everything from job opportunities to mental health, from recognition to reintegration. People were starting to listen, and it felt like something important was finally coming to life. "I'm starting to hear people talk about a group for veterans," Ryan said, glancing at his father. "They want to make sure everyone gets the support they need. They want to create a place where veterans can speak up, get the resources they deserve. People are actually listening, Dad. I think it's really going to happen." Tom didn't look up right away, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. His fingers tightened around his glass, and he took a slow sip before speaking, his voice quiet but measured. "Maybe it's about time," he muttered. "Maybe they're finally seeing what we've been saying all along." Ryan looked at him, studying his father's face. The lines around Tom's eyes deepened as he set the glass down, his shoulders slumping slightly. He wasn't just reacting to the news about the veterans group. Ryan could see the weight of years behind his words, the things Tom had lived through. The battles, the losses, the countless silent moments that had gone unnoticed had shaped him into the man Ryan knew. And yet, for all the quiet strength, there was always something unspoken between them, something buried deep inside his father. Ryan leaned forward, unable to keep his curiosity at bay any longer. "Dad, what was it really like? I mean, I know you've told me bits and pieces, but I've never really understood. What was it like for you after you came back?" Tom's gaze drifted to the window, where the first few stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He didn't answer immediately, and for a moment, Ryan thought his father might not respond at all. But then Tom sighed heavily, as though he had been holding on to the weight of that question for years. "It wasn't easy," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as though he was speaking to himself. "When I came back, I didn't know where I fit in anymore. Everything had changed. People, the town, the world. It was all different. And I was different too. The hardest part wasn't the war. It was coming back and realizing I wasn't the same man who left. The world had moved on, but I was still stuck in that place. Ryan listened intently, knowing that his father had never spoken like this before. It was as if the question Ryan had asked had unlocked something that had been buried deep within Tom for years. Ryan knew the stories, the ones he'd been told when he was younger, the heroic tales of battles fought and brothers lost. But this was different. This was the reality of what happened when a soldier came home. I tried to find my place again, Tom continued, his voice thick with the weight of the years. But it wasn't easy. There were days when I'd wake up and wonder what the hell I was even doing here. There were nights when the quiet would swallow me whole, and I didn't know if I could keep going. But you do. You keep going, because you have to. And the people around you, they don't always see it. They don't understand what you've been through, what it takes to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. Ryan's heart clenched as he heard the pain in his father's voice. It wasn't a new story, but it was a side of his father that Ryan had never fully grasped before. The quiet isolation, the struggle to fit into a world that had changed while he was away. It made everything else make sense. "I never wanted you to see that side of me, Ryan," Tom said, his gaze still fixed on the window. "I didn't want you to carry that weight. But I guess sometimes we have to share those things. Sometimes it's the only way to keep moving forward." Ryan swallowed hard, his chest tight. "You don't have to hide it, Dad. I'm here. I get it now." Tom turned to look at him, and for a moment, there was a softness in his eyes that Ryan had never seen before. "I know you do, and I'm proud of you, son. More than you'll ever know." Ryan nodded, unsure of what to say next. But in that moment, he realized that his father's strength wasn't just about enduring. It was about the quiet moments of sharing, of showing vulnerability, of reaching out to the people who mattered most. And Ryan knew then that he had a choice. This town, his father, the veterans, had all been given a voice, one that had been silenced for too long. The town was changing, slowly but surely, and Ryan was going to be part of that change. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. As he sat there next to his father, he understood that the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had made the first step. Together, they had started something, and that was all that mattered. The town hall meeting was scheduled for the following week, and the days leading up to it felt charged with a nervous energy. Ryan had never seen his town quite like this before. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, an undercurrent of hope, but also an awareness of the challenge ahead. For so long, things had been the way they were, and now, in the span of a few weeks, the fabric of the community had begun to change, thread by thread. Ryan arrived at the town hall early, the parking lot already filling up with cars as people gathered for what was expected to be a defining moment. He saw familiar faces, and some not so familiar, people who had been quiet, who had avoided the difficult conversations. Today they were showing up, they were listening. Inside, the room was filled with the low murmur of conversations. There were people from all walks of life, young and old, veterans and civilians, those who had never experienced war firsthand, but knew the value of those who had. Ryan stood in the back, near the door, surveying the room. His heart raced in his chest, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. But this was why he had been fighting. This was the culmination of everything. The efforts of Jack, the other veterans, and all those who had stepped up in their own way. As he stood there, Jack walked in, his weathered face full of purpose, his posture straight. He scanned the room, nodding to those who acknowledged him as he made his way toward the front. Ryan joined him, and together they stood near the stage, awaiting the beginning of the meeting. "Looks like we've got a full house," Jack said, his voice steady. But there was a glint of something in his eyes, a quiet pride, maybe even a little surprise at how far things had come. Ryan nodded, taking in the crowd. "It's more than I expected. People are really showing up. It's happening, Jack." Jack gave him a sideways glance, his lips pulling into a small, knowing smile. "It's because they finally understand. It's because of what you did, what you stood for." Ryan was about to say something when the room fell into silence. The mayor, a man in his mid-50s, stood at the front of the room, signaling for everyone to settle down. The energy in the room shifted, and all eyes turned to him. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice carrying through the room. "Thank you all for coming," the mayor began, his tone surprisingly solemn. "This meeting, this gathering of voices, is long overdue. We are here today because of the actions of one young man, Ryan Thompson, and the veterans of our town who have brought this issue to light. We are here because we can no longer ignore the sacrifices made by those who have served our country and the responsibility we have as a community to honor them in every way we can. The room erupted into applause, a wave of support that rippled through the crowd. Ryan could feel the weight of the moment settling in, his heart pounding in his chest. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the veterans. It was about Jack. It was about everyone who had been overlooked and dismissed for too long. The mayor continued, outlining the town's new commitment to the veterans' cause, the formation of a Veterans Resource Center, funding for healthcare services, educational opportunities, and job placement programs. But there was one more thing he mentioned, one more gesture that felt like a turning point. We also want to make sure that our veterans are heard, the mayor said. And that's why we've created a position for a liaison, a representative who will sit on the town council and be the voice of our veterans, someone who knows firsthand the struggles they face and can advocate for their needs. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if the mayor had intended it, but the implication was clear. This was something that would affect everyone who had served, and the person who would take on this role was standing in the room. The mayor's eyes landed on Ryan, a slight nod of acknowledgement. There it was. Ryan hadn't been expecting it, hadn't prepared for it, but the recognition was undeniable. The room grew quiet as the mayor's words settled in. Ryan felt a mix of emotions rush through him: pride, surprise, even a little fear. He wasn't ready to take on such a responsibility. But then he realized something. This wasn't about being ready. It was about stepping forward, just as he had done when he first spoke up for Jack. This was about doing what was right, regardless of whether he felt prepared for it or not. Jack, standing beside him, gave him a look, a small, knowing glance, and Ryan realized that this was the moment, the same moment where Jack had stood up in the cafe, where Ryan had raised his voice. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the change they were all part of. It was about honoring the people who had given so much and doing whatever it took to make sure they were never forgotten again. The applause that followed the mayor's announcement was deafening. It wasn't just for Ryan. It was for the veterans, for everyone who had been part of this movement. It was for the town itself, finally waking up to its responsibilities, finally recognizing the debt it owed. And it was for Jack and the countless other men and women who had served, who had sacrificed, who had kept fighting even when the world didn't seem to care. As the meeting concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Ryan felt a quiet sense of fulfillment wash over him. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction that came from winning a battle. It was deeper than that. It was the satisfaction of knowing that, together, they had changed something. They had made a stand, and that stand had rippled outward, touching more people than he could have ever imagined. As Ryan walked out of the town hall, Jack by his side, he looked up at the sky, the fading light of the day painting everything in shades of gold and purple. It wasn't just the end of a meeting. It was the beginning of something new, something lasting, and Ryan knew, without a doubt, that this was just the first step. The real work was still ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready for it. They walked down the street together, side by side, the weight of the future no longer a burden, but a shared responsibility. Whatever came next, Ryan knew they wouldn't face it alone, and that made all the difference.